All right, it's Eldon back here with another continuing episode of the Crazy Dad Garage, and today we're going to talk about the first series of videos on the Crazy Dad Lotus. So if you'll remember, this is a project that I picked up from a friend of mine named Dan, and he'd gotten to a point where he and his son had gotten in a car wreck and couldn't work on it, and he just got discouraged and decided to get rid of it. And when we picked it up, the first thing we're going to start on here is the chassis. And it's actually the part of the car that was in the worst condition. It had been in a wreck very early on in its life, and whoever repaired it didn't hardly repair it. They did a little bit of work on it. There is a patch of metal somebody welded over some crinkled sheet metal in that chassis, and it was in bad shape. And mostly it was just dangling there by a few barely still held on spot welds. So when I first started doing this, I was not in full Crazy Dad video mode, so I've got a bunch of still photos along with some video of it, but I'm going to do a little explanation, throw a few videos or still photos in here, and then do a little more explanation, throw the next few, and so we'll kind of go that way through the first parts of this until you see where we're at with this chassis. So the first couple of pictures I'm going to show you are kind of, okay, this is where we started, this is what we had to work with, and how we're going to figure it out. And actually this is the part of the car that my friend was really frustrated with, to the point that he had almost decided to just spend the money and buy a new chassis for the thing. You can actually buy a reproduction chassis for them. There's some guys that actually make a tube chassis for the thing that's probably quite a bit stronger and more designed for racing. And they're out there, but hey, I'm a fabricator. I like to do things a low buck way. I've got a lot of metalworking experience, and so I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, I can fix that. So this is where we're going to start. We'll take the first few pictures here. They're going to show you that the chassis is made of a main front to back member with a front cross member on it, and that front cross member was what was really mangled. And so you can see in some of the pictures, the chassis is a rectangular shaped the member that comes to the front. And you're going to be able to see the front cross member is separated from it now, and then the next thing you're going to do is be able to see that rectangular space on the front cross member, and you're going to be able to see all the holes where the welds ripped out of the sheet metal, and the sheet metal was just distorted and bent and mangled and all kinds of things. So I'm going to quickly run you through some of those pictures, and then I'll explain to you where we went from there so that you can kind of see what it looks like. So watch these and look at it and maybe laugh, maybe go, ugh, I'd never tackle that, or whatever. But really for me it was just some basic fabrication stuff. It's kind of a cross between all my experience in bodyworking and blacksmithing, because you're dealing with some sheet metal that's just a little bit heavier than the sheet metal that the car body's made out of, but it's heavy enough that you start getting into kind of some blacksmithing type stuff. And so we'll take that. I'll show you where we started, and then I'll come back here and shoot another quick video to explain the next steps that we took in that. Okay, so after looking that over and trying to decide how to go about doing this, I got to looking at it and think, you know what? That thing's sheet metal. It's put together with spot welds just like a car body is. I think I'm going to cut it apart and then straighten the individual pieces and put them back together. That was my first thought, and then real quickly I realized that, you know what, most of that damage on that front cross member was kind of centralized on one side of it. And I looked at it and I went, you know what, I'll bet I can just cut a chunk of that side out and be able to get this thing where I'm trying to go here. And so that's what we did. These next few pictures, you're going to see the straight lines that I used a cutoff wheel on my grinder to cut through the thing and get it where I needed it to go. So I made a straight cut all the way through the middle of it, kind of a little bit to one side of the center. And then rather than trying to take the thing completely apart around all of the suspension mounting points, I decided to cut it just inside of those, where I could, I knew there was some backing in there that when I welded I could weld that back to not just the mating piece that I cut it off of, but to the piece behind it, so that I would get a good solid weld in there. And so that's the next thing I did, was cut those apart on those lines, and you'll be able to see those lines here in these next few pictures. Okay, now these next series of pictures are going to show the process of cutting those spot welds loose, so that the rest of the thing would come loose from all the interior pieces as well as the exterior parts that have been welded to. And there's a really cool tool that not everybody knows about. There's one that's called a spot weld cutter. I've gotten one of those, and it was kind of cheap and wimpy, and it worked, but not very well and for very long. And this one I happened to find in a shop that I used to work in, and so I went out and bought me one. It's called a Rotabroach, and I've gotten these at a welding supply store, and basically it's just a little hole cutter. And what you do is you take a center punch and you locate each of those spot welds, and take a center punch and punch a little divot right in the middle of it. And then the Rotabroach has a pin that sticks out that's pointed, and you stick that pin down in your center punched hole and start the cut. And you have to be careful, they'll jump out of the cuts real easy a lot of times, but if you go easy on them, pretty quick you get the hang of it. And you just go along and you drill out each of those spot welds just through the first layer of metal, and what it does is it frees it up from the back layer, and then you can get a chisel in there and pop that thing off, and bingo, after a little while, when you get all those welds drilled out finally, you're going to be able to pop that off. And so you're going to be able to see that process in a couple of those pictures there, and there's a picture or two of the tool that I'm telling you about. And so we got that piece then where it would pop off, so that I could get to it and get behind it. All right, then the next series of pictures here, once I had that that outside shell off, what that did was gave me access to the back of it, so I was able to take some hammers and some dollies and things like that and worked it on a workbench. And it took a lot of work, but I was able to get that sheet metal back to where it was straight again. And then I was able to weld up the tears in it. And then that was on the outer shell piece that would end up being a kind of a C-shaped piece at that point. And I was able to get it all flattened back out where I needed it to be, pretty close. I mean, it still wasn't, a perfectly symmetrical flat piece of metal, but from all my experience in doing this kind of stuff, I knew that it was close enough that I could, start welding it back into place on the other piece and get it perfectly straight and flat as I needed it to be in the process of that. So I got that C-shaped piece cleaned up. Then I went back and to the rest of that front cross member and was able to get into it with some hammers, some dollies. I ended up using, I had to get some long round pieces of metal that I could hammer on because some of the parts were in the way, couldn't get hammered directly on them, but a punch, different things like that, and be able to, again, body work that, the inside of that cross member back into the right condition so that I could get it straightened out. And I think that's where I'm at right now on the pictures, is getting those two pieces straightened out, and then we'll talk about what we went to from there. Okay, so there you have, that's the first series of the videos about getting that chassis torn apart and getting those new pieces straightened back out. And this is going to take a little more time, so we're going to start into a second video here. This will be a part 2 of the chassis of the Crazy Dad Lotus.